Everybody likes to feel right, so I'll throw us all a bone here. Because if you love avoiding conflict, and if you judge by our actions, we all love avoiding conflict, then there's some really good reasons why the mind is avoiding conflict. You can't lose if you don't play. I call that being risk averse. And two, conflict means that somebody messed up, and that could even be you. There's also another really good reason that the body avoids conflict. The body doesn't know the difference between life-threatening conflict and ego-threatening conflict. As you know, I'm probably not here to congratulate you on avoiding conflict. The theme for this season is the only way out is through, right? But here we are building a safe container for going on this journey together. I'm looking into your eyes, we're holding hands, we're understanding, and pretty soon we'll be able to get to the next step. That won't be for a little while. So let me take it from the top and we'll go into these 3 good reasons why we all avoid conflict, and then we'll see what we could do about it. So the first one was you can't lose if you don't play. It's basically a kind of risk aversion. And this is basically the fantasy that a situation, even if it's a shitty one, is never going to get worse. Or that it's preferable to have the shitty situation rather than poking the dragon and ending up in a much worse situation. So here's a real life example, which is current for me. I have a client who was offended by some changes I made to a space we both use. So, she made her complaints known. I stopped doing my dastardly nefarious changes. And then I reached out to her to see if her needs were met, what we could do to repair, anything else that had to happen. And of course, this person has not responded, and it's been weeks. So in my mind, that means she's using that strategy, can't lose if you don't play. Or that I'm such an unsafe person that having a phone call is really outside of her comfort zone, which is also possible. But really, it's probably because the current energetic situation, even though it's shitty, is good enough for her. She has her space, I'm no longer messing with her, why disturb the peace? If we actually had a conversation, things could get better, but they could also get worse. So that's the first reason. And it really is a good reason, especially if you're sure that the current situation is way better than what would likely happen if you address the conflict. Problem is that we can't really trust ourselves to think like a rational risk analyst in any of these conflict situations because we're usually out of our comfort zones, into our panic zones, and totally freaking out and irrational and not really seeing things clearly or objectively. The second one, if you remember, is that conflict means that somebody messed up. So this is all wrapped up in all the great guilt and shame that we carry. And it really, at the core, is the idea that conflict itself is anomalous.
Creating the otherwise contradictory systemic anomaly.
And it only happens when somebody behaved poorly, which means that somebody is a bad person. There's always someone responsible, and that is a very, very, very naughty bad person. And that bad person might be you. So of course, we don't want to go anywhere near that because we don't want to risk the notion that that bad person is us. And there's some truth here. You probably messed up. You're probably at fault for some part of this conflict, as I am in the example I just gave. But usually, unless you're intentionally starting wars in the Middle East, you messed up because you didn't understand or care about what somebody in the situation really wanted. Like in the example above, I definitely messed with that person's space. I am guilty. But did I want to throw that person off? Did I want to disrespect them? Did I want to make their life difficult? No. I just wanted to improve the space for everybody involved. Am I a bad person because of it? No. Was it even an objectively bad thing that I did? No. It was just a bad move because I didn't do my communication homework first. And what's really sly about this situation is how the guilt and shame dynamic is going to slow things down, making the situation get worse. So I told you in this example how the person has not responded to me in weeks, and how that's an example of conflict avoidance because they think, oh, better the status quo than risking something that's going to get worse. But I did not tell you that after the time she sent her hurt email to me, I spent weeks doing nothing instead of responding because I was locked in a cycle of guilt. I was like, oh God, I really don't want to be the guy who did that. So I'm just not going to address it. Was that helpful? No. Is that a master stroke of conflict resolution diplomacy? No. Do you think that person is feeling worse and worse because I did that? Yes. Busted. So those are 2 reasons why the mind is really interested in avoiding conflict. The third one has to do with the body. And this is the sense from the body that conflict is going to kill us. The body actually doesn't know the difference between a conflict that will kill us, like many conflicts had in the evolution of our species, and a conflict that is just going to be damaging to the superficial ego structure of our minds. So the pop neuroscientists would talk about the lizard brain getting the panic zone and only want fight or flight or freeze, or something else that starts with F. I like to think of it as a confusion between the biological organism and the ego structure. And bad news for the ego structure, every conflict is dangerous to the ego structure.
No.
That's because most agreements involve some amount of understanding, some amount of accepting the other person's reality, their perceptions, what they think, having a new awareness of what conflict meant to them or what our actions meant to them. And that's a kind of death for us. That's a kind of broad, technically, it's an enlarging of the self. It's a growing, but it is one kind of death. So a little death, a little growth, a little rebirth, all that stuff, incredibly scary for the impregnable fortress of the current self. So yeah, the body's right. It's threatening, but not in the way we think. So now, as promised, I'm going to hold your hand and show us the way forward, which is going to involve infinite personal growth, worldwide peace and prosperity, and millions of dollars for you just by engaging in conflict. Here is the one criteria that will help you determine when to avoid and when to engage in conflict and not just listen blindly to the body-mind complex, which never wants to do it because of the risk and the guilt and the shame and the specter of death. You are thus commanded to engage in conflict when avoiding it is worse. That's it. I know. Simple, lame, cost-benefit analysis, spreadsheets, boring, rational. But that's it. I did have two other candidates. One was deeply spiritual and one was all about integral philosophy, but I don't think they'd be nearly as effective to share, so I'll save those for later. Once again, you are thus commanded to engage in conflict when avoiding it is worse. But of course, you cannot trust the intuitions of people who are involved in conflict, especially yourself. So the right way to evaluate which is worth is to write out in a really boring, methodical way all of the potential negative consequences of avoiding this conflict. And then you read the list. And if there's nothing terrible in there, you get to second guess yourself and be like, is that really possible? So you check in with the friend.
Hey, Unc!
And you ask the friend to help you make this list to see if you miss anything. And if your friend finds nothing terrible, you win. You get to keep avoiding. But if either of you find some crippling long-term consequences of avoiding this conflict, then you get to put consequences in one hand and the pain of engaging in the other and determine which one is heavier. Look, I'm being as fair and dry as possible. I'm not saying anything about the long-term spiritual benefits or the character building or the leadership qualities or the fact that the conflict is embedded in the relationship and this is a spiritual path, or even how dealing with your own shit is going to help the natural interest or the evolution of humanity. I'm not saying any of that. I want you to make a fair and rational and impartial decision taking into account the fears of your body-mind complex. And we'll get to the other stuff later. But please remember, our mantra for the season, the only way out is through. So we're new to YouTube and we would love your feedback. Please comment, subscribe, follow, tell all your friends, and let us know what you think.